Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Maldonado D'Amico. I'm Yale College class of 1993, and I'm so pleased to be here to commemorate 150 years of women at the university and 50 years of women in Yale College. Welcome to the fourth and final day of this historic symposium. We have another amazing lineup of speakers and topics for today, but first, I wanted to take you back in time for a moment. In 1869, Alice Silliman and Susan Silliman, granddaughters of Professor Benjamin Silliman, became two of the first three students at what is now known as the School of Art. 100 years later, in 1969, the first women students of Yale College arrived on Old Campus, becoming part of the classes of 1971, 1972, and 1973. The New York Times called them superwomen. You can read more about this pivotal moment in Yale history in a fantastic book called Yale Needs Women by Anne Gardner Perkins. A few years later, in 1977, President Kingman Brewster retired. Provost Hannah Holborn Gray became interim president of Yale, while still serving as provost, holding two demanding jobs at once. President Gray is the first and the only female president of Yale. When I arrived on campus in 1989 from a small working class town northeast of Philadelphia, I saw posters and table tents and t-shirts and events celebrating 20 years of women at Yale. I was too young to understand what a blip in Yale's history that really was, but it sounded pretty cool at the time. I proudly wore my t-shirt and button and taped up a celebration poster on the wall of my room in TD. The October after I graduated in 1993, the now iconic women's table, designed by Maya Lin, was installed on Cross Campus next to Sterling. Fast forward 30 years. When I joined the YAA team planning this capstone event for 50 Women at Yale 150, the original plan was for a big splashy event in November in the sparkling new Schwartzman Center. And then the world fell apart. Once we regrouped, we decided to move the symposium to online to September. But there were so many questions. How would we do it? Could we still secure the speakers we wanted? And would the Yale community still attend? We rolled up our sleeves, took a deep breath, and got to work. Now, what I'm about to tell you will come as no surprise. When we asked, the women of Yale stepped forward and said, yes. Yes, I will help. Yes, I will attend. Yes, I will speak. Yes, yes, yes. And that is what I love about the women of Yale. They will find a way to say yes, even when the technology is glitchy, even when the kids need attention, when a deadline looms, when the world feels uncertain and scary. The women of Yale really are superwomen. And so, on this final day of the 150th anniversary symposium, we'll hear from a few more of those superwomen. First, you'll hear from Barbara Bush, who will talk about her passion for working with young people. Then, you'll hear from a rare gathering of Yale women who attended Yale College in different decades and went on to teach at Yale. Eve Hart-Rice, one of the co-chairs of 50 Women at Yale 150, will share a few words with you. Emmy Mahmood, the 2015 World Poetry Slam champion, will perform 2 stunning poems for you. Congresswoman Katie Porter will talk about serving in Congress while juggling demands as a single mom. And Weili Cheng, the executive director of the Yale Alumni Association, will close out the symposium. Please know that all of these events are being recorded and will be available for later viewing online. They will also be archived as part of the historical record of women at Yale. Finally, we have a few more encore events planned through the end of the calendar year, so be on the lookout for those too. Thanks to all of you who volunteered, who stepped up, and who have joined us to participate in these historic celebrations for the women of Yale. Now, on to our program.
Hi everyone, my name is Kanya Balakrishna. I'm Yale class of 2009 and I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Future Project, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to training young people everywhere to use their passion and purpose to change the world. As part of the 150th anniversary of Women at Yale, I am so excited to speak with Barbara Bush, Yale class of 2004, about youth leadership today. Barbara is the co-founder and board chair of Global Health Corps, an organization that mobilizes a global community of young leaders to build the movement for health equity. Since 2009, Global Health Corps has supported over 1,000 young leaders to support the world's most pressing global health issues. Welcome, Barbara.
Thanks, Kanya. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. So Barbara, we share a belief that young people have extraordinary power to shape the world around them, to build a better future for all of us. Where did that belief come from for you? When did you first realize your power to lead and make change?
Great question. Well, thanks for having me and thanks to everyone for joining us. I first had that belief when I was young myself. I'm afraid I'm not quite so young anymore. It was actually when I was at Yale, and I really started to see the power of young people because of my interest in global health. When I was a student at Yale, I assumed that I was going to be an architect. That's what I'd always loved. And that's what I'd always been interested in growing up. And I was lucky my junior year of college, I was lucky that summer to travel with my parents. And this is incredibly cliche to say that travel changed my life, but it did. At that time, it was in 2003, and we were traveling to East and Southern Africa for the launch of PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And at the time, if you were living on the continent of Africa, you could not have access to the life-saving medicine that you needed if you were HIV positive, which we had in the United States, which any of us in the United States could have walked to our local CVS and gotten antiretroviral drugs. And we would have had a chronic illness that we could have lived with for the rest of our days. But if you lived on the continent of Africa, you simply could not get access to these drugs. And that was because pharmaceutical companies didn't distribute them there. And so the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief provides free drugs for people living with HIV in developing countries around the world. And at the time, it was estimated that 15 million Africans would die in the next 10 years. These stark numbers and images that are mind-blowing that existed in the 2000s. And when I was there for the launch of this program, it's very cliche. I was very young. I was very idealistic. I was just completely shocked to see hundreds of people waiting in the street for drugs that scientists and doctors and researchers had spent their time to create these incredible tools. But if you were poor, you didn't get access to them. And so I became obsessed with global health. Quick side note, flash forward, now 12 million people are alive because of this incredible policy that all Americans are responsible for. I came back to Yale, I dropped my architecture major, and I studied as many global health classes as existed at the time. And the reason that I, through that, became interested in the power of young people is I ended up meeting with all of these incredible leaders in the field of global health. And one of them, a man named Peter Piot, was running UNAIDS at the time. And he, like many of the titans in global health, had gotten their interest because of the AIDS crisis. They were doctors, they were nurses, they were family members of people with AIDS in the 80s, when there was tremendous amount of fear, when no one knew how it was spread or how it was contracted. And they would show up every day combating that fear to serve people, whether they were doctors or whether they were family members serving their family members. And because of that, they all got interested in global health. And as time happens, they ended up leading all the major institutions in global health, and which is incredible. And, we have so much to thank all of them for. But I ended up having this conversation with Peter, and his big concern was that this meant that so many of the leaders were going to retire at the same time. And he was about to retire from UNAIDS, and he was really worried about who was going to take up this cause. And especially because our generation was lucky not to live in this type of fear. I mean, we have a different fear around COVID, and we'll see if this does increase the number of young people interested in health. But we were lucky to not have that fear. And so his big concern was that as all these titans retire, and as we've made so much progress in global health, will young people think we've made enough progress and not engage? And then in health, you can quickly slide backwards in health outcomes.
Right.
And so he gave me this call to call to arms, essentially, of how are you going to engage your generation to fight global health? Mm-hmm. And what was amazing about that is our generation was already engaged. More young people want to work on social change than ever before. And so we started Global Health Course specifically around this call to tap into the tremendous interest that young people have in affecting change and in living lives of purpose. And while Global Health Course specifically focused on, obviously, global health outcomes and solving global health issues, we see so many organizations like yours and like Teach for America and Teach for All that are really tapping into this younger potential. And we've seen so quickly through Global Health Corps, we've now had, as you mentioned before, we've worked with over 1,000 young leaders from around the world. We accept 1% of the applicants that apply to Global Health Corps. And it's not, we wish we weren't quite as competitive. The reason we are is because there's so much interest. And what's been incredible is giving opportunities to young people through the Global Health Corps program, where they work in global health every day for a year, and they go through our curriculum throughout the year focused on entrepreneurship, advocacy, policy change, so they have the skills they need to make a bigger impact in global health. And then they have this tight network of sort of comrades in the field of global health that they work with through the thousands of their peers. And what we've seen that's incredible is, even though our crew is young, they're leaders. And we saw this, the more exposure that they've been given to global health issues and mentorship and seeing real change in the gray area that exists every day when you're working in complex health systems, we've seen them step up. And so, for instance, when the Ebola crisis happened, we saw our alumni community mobilize, and about 50 of them moved to Liberia and Sierra Leone to address the Ebola crisis. And they didn't just move there. They opened the Partners in Health office there. They worked for the Ministry of Health. They were the executive directors of a number of organizations. And, they were 35 and under, but because they'd been given such intense exposure, and because they believed they were leaders, which you often don't believe when you're young, they stepped up, and they knew that if they weren't going to do this, who else was?
That's beautiful. It must make you so proud to see the alumni, stepping up in a time of need. I'm curious, you said a couple of times that our generation and studies, I think research is showing that the generation coming up now is even more purposeful and more committed, than ever to making change and leading change in their world. Why do you think that is? What are the factors, in society as we were growing up that influenced, our sense of responsibility or obligation or purpose or passion, for making change in the world?
I mean, that's a great question. I do believe that when you're little, you really can believe you can change the world. I definitely know like that. Like I remember starting a recycling program in second grade for my school. I mean, I remember really thinking that this is something we're all capable of doing. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes as you move through life, you become more cynical or you see different obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. That, you know, that's on all of us to make sure we don't continue to do that as we grow older and have more experiences. But I think in many ways, young people haven't experienced that as much. And so they can maintain this incredible optimism that is often fueled by anger or fueled by seeing injustices that each of us want to address. And I think a big thing that's different, and I'm afraid that I'm probably a generation older than you, Tanya, but I think connectivity has had a huge impact. And I know we talk a lot about, how the internet is a huge change. It is, obviously, and we talk about social networks. But I think what's even more inspiring is when now you live in a global world. You are a global citizen because the media that you're consuming, the tools that you're using, the other young people that you can interact with so easily now via your phone prove that you are living in a global world. And I felt like I was a global citizen when I was at Yale in 2004 as well. But I think now with the proliferation of such simple and easy ways to connect, it seems even bigger. And I think the reason that matters is, we see like with Greta Thunberg and the climate march last year, 6 million people, young people marched. And that's organized by a high schooler, and it's high schoolers marching. And it does really make me think, what are each of these young people going to do as they get older, as they've seen the strength of numbers of their peers who also care, which is so mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, that's I think a very powerful actually call to action for the adults in society to find ways to inspire and support young people to, like you said, believe they can lead and believe they can make change. So I'm just curious, what do you think is our obligation as a society to young people, especially to young people of color, to young women, to young people who are living at the margins of society? What's our obligation to them so that they can be ready to lead in the future and today?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, and I want to hear your answer to this too. Each of us easily can play a role. I think a huge thing, maybe this sounds cliche and maybe this sounds small, but I think it's really important to let people that you interact with know that they're enough. And I think it's really important to do that with young people that you interact with. When we at Global Health Core Training, when we say who here thinks they're a leader, very few people raise their hand at the beginning of the year because, when you're young, you feel like you're not a leader because you haven't had a wealth of experiences. And I think that that's something that each of us in our day-to-day life can do, is make sure that the young people we're around believe that they're enough. I think it's incredibly important for each of us to look at our own networks and see what they look like. With Global Health Core, actually 75% of our fellows are women. I believe 70% are people of color. And that is intentional because if you look at the field of global health, the leaders are traditionally male, white, and Western. Yeah. And that's great, and I don't want to criticize that because we've made tremendous strides in global health. But in many ways, we feel like it's our responsibility, if we're seeding the field with talent, to make sure that we're seeding the field with talent that has not always been represented at the table in making decisions in global health, particularly if we're making decisions about women's health or health, social determinants of health that disproportionately impact minority communities. And I think really now is a moment in the United States where each of us are thinking about our own power and our own privilege. And we need to do the same about thinking about our networks. And if our networks aren't diverse, particularly in the young people that we're mentoring or working alongside, to do something about that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And, I think on the Future Project side, we work with high school age students. I think for exactly the reason you just said is that, young people, they have in them, I think that inherent belief that they can make change, but they don't always, they almost don't always believe themselves, And so what we hope to be able to do is to give them experiences, opportunities to almost practice, making change and leading and exploring the things that they really care about, because a lot of the Future Project's belief comes from the idea that if you find the thing that lights you up like you did, when you went on that trip, if you find the thing that moves you, that angers you or excites you, and that you're really good at, that you feel in your element around, then, your whole life can be a life of contribution no matter what path you take. So that's our hope with the Future Project. And hopefully we're helping to create a pipeline for Global Health Corps and, other organizations like yours.
Absolutely. I love that. So important.
Well, I'm curious, we are living obviously in a very challenging moment in our country and in the entire world. And, I imagine there's a lot of young people out there, young people as young as high school age, but also, in their 20s and their 30s who are looking around and wondering, what their role is right now. They might be feeling hopeful. They might be feeling, hopeless. And they might be wondering how the world needs them to step up right now. And so I'm curious, what do you want to say to them? What do you want them to know? What do you hope they'll do right now in this really critical moment?
I love that question. And so much of it, I think, speaks to what you were just saying. Right now, there's a million things to be angry about. There's also a million things to be hopeful for. And this is so cheesy, but I can't help it. There's that incredible Mr. Rogers quote about when he said to his mom, I think when he was young, about disasters and feeling hopeless about them. And essentially she said, always look for the helpers. And I think that right now is an incredible time to think about that, whether it's COVID or whether it's looking to people marching in the streets for the movement for Black lives. And what's ironic is right now we actually do need young people more than ever because of COVID. We need young people because they're not in compromised health. They're not in groups that are considered compromised. Right. And so, I was thinking about this 2 weeks ago was National Poll Worker Day. And we have a shortage of poll workers in the United States, and we actually need young people to be poll workers to make sure that our democracy will run smoothly. And we need them because they have great health. And to your point before, I think that now is an incredible moment where people feel intense emotions. And if we can channel those emotions, particularly young people's emotions, away from cynicism and away from helplessness, and I think you combat cynicism by being able to take action, then I can't think of how many young people will have their thing that lights them up or that makes them so mad they want to do something about that. And we could easily see that in racial justice right now. We already see that so many of the young leaders in the movement for Black lives, so many of the leaders in the movement for Black lives are young. With COVID, we need young people to be serving their elderly neighbors. We need them to be volunteering right now. And to your point before, these are opportunities that let young people practice what it is to be a leader and practice what lights them up and practice stepping up. And I do believe, there's that Malcolm Gladwell book about doing 10,000 hours. You get exceptional something. And I think, we think of that with like Bill Gates had 10,000 hours of coding, but we can also have 10,000 hours of serving other people and 10,000 hours of collaborating and working on teams and 10,000 hours of problem solving or whatever it might be that's so important to changing the world. And young people have a chance to start practicing for their 10,000 hours or gaining their 10,000 hours now.
I think that is a beautiful way of thinking about it. And, I hope that, we as a society can sort of fulfill our obligation to the future by ensuring that young people have those chances to practice and to get their 10,000 hours as they grow up, because the vision, I think, of the world, a vision of a world in which, every person feels empowered, to make change, even in a small scale, is a pretty exciting one. So I'm just curious, as we wrap up here, what you want to say to the rest of society, to the adults, to the schools, to the organizations, to the people who are responsible for making sure that young people grow up, with everything that they need. What do you want all of us to hear from you and to do as we move forward?
Mm-hmm. It's pretty simple. I think we need to make sure we give young people a chance to lead. And that looks like letting young people take on more responsibility, take on things that they don't even believe that they can do so that they can learn that they can do them. And that's something that we can all do, is making sure that we cultivate their voices and give them opportunities to step up, especially in a time when we definitely need more young people to step up.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Barbara, for a fantastic discussion. It was so much fun to hear how you came to your belief, and congratulations on everything that you and the Global Health Core team have done in the last 10 years.
Thank you. Thanks, Kanya. I'm so excited to have chatted with you, and I've long loved the work of the Future Project. So
Thank you.
With you. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Tamar Gendler, and I'm a proud graduate of the Yale College class of 1987. I also have the extraordinary privilege of serving as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University. The Faculty of Arts and Sciences is the place where all of the departments and programs that offer courses in Yale College and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences sit. During the days when I was not dean, I had the pleasure of serving as a professor of philosophy, of cognitive science, and of psychology, and of teaching a course that tried to bring together works from the ancient and early modern Western philosophical tradition with contemporary work in cognitive science and cognitive psychology. And I'm incredibly honored as an alumna, as a teacher, and as a Yale College parent to be hosting this panel today. The panel today brings together a group of women who were undergraduates at Yale College in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, who went on to become faculty in the college and to teach students here at Yale. And it represents one of the many extraordinary milestones that we are celebrating in this 50 Women at Yale 150 celebration. The 50th anniversary of Women in Yale College, the 150th anniversary of Women at Yale University. Our session will last an hour. It will be recorded. So if you ask a question, know that the words that you say will be broadcast to others. And during the final 20 minutes, we'll reserve the conversation for our opportunity to respond to questions from you. So let me now introduce you to our 5 extraordinary panelists. Let me begin with Margaret Homans, Yale College class of 1974, professor of English and professor of women's gender and sexuality studies. In her courses and publications on Victorian, modern, and contemporary literature, Professor Homans has focused on women writers who explore questions of gender, sexuality, power, and identity, opening both to fellow academics and to undergraduates the ways in which these questions are addressed through literature. Let me introduce you second to Elizabeth Alexander, member of the Yale College class of 1984, poet, educator, memoirist, scholar, cultural advocate. Elizabeth Alexander has recently moved to a position as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, one of the foundations that has played a central role in shaping the questions that American educational institutions are able to address. Prior to her time at the Mellon Foundation, Dr. Alexander taught at Yale for a decade and a half in English and African American Studies and served as chair of the African American Studies Department. Third, let me introduce you to Ana Ramos Zayas, member of the Yale College class of 1990, professor of ethnicity, race, and migration, and professor of American Studies and of anthropology. The work of Professor Ramos Zayas aims to understand and disentangle systems of power and privilege at a variety of scales, ranging from US imperial and white supremacist politics at the macroscopic level to questions about how individuals and communities make sense of everyday forms of power and subordination. Fourth, I'm proud to introduce you to Beverly Gage, member of the Yale College class of 1994, professor of American history and director of the Brady Johnson Grand Strategy Program. Professor Gage's courses focus on American politics, on political thought, on social movements, and on governance broadly construed. Finally, Denise Ho, representing the New Century, member of the Yale College class of 2000, assistant professor of history at Yale and a scholar of 20th century Chinese history. Professor Ho is a historian of modern China with particular focus on the social and cultural history of China during the period of Mao. So as you can hear, this is a group diverse in its intellectual focus, diverse in its era of participation as a student at Yale, and diverse in its experiences. But what I want to do before we talk about the issues that I hope we can address today, the issues of women and education at a university like Yale, is just to give you a chance to get to know each of our panelists. So I want to start by asking you just to give a brief word picture of the 18-year-old you who arrived at Yale in 1970 or 1990 or 1996. Give us a little picture of who you were, what you were like, and then a little picture of who you are and what you do now, so that as we tell the rest of the stories we tell, our audience has an understanding of who they are hearing from. And I'll do this piece in chronological order by graduation year. So let me begin with Margaret Homans.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in this company. When I arrived at Yale in September of 1970, I was a very naive 17-year-old. I had come from a progressive, urban, co-educated high school. I was completely unprepared for the all-male student body, all-male faculty, all-male culture of Yale. The things I was excited about Yale were two, principally. I was excited about studying literature, and I was excited about coming to the place where May Day had just happened. In those days, activism primarily meant the Black Panthers and anti-war activism. But Yale turned me into a feminist because I had to do something in response to the extraordinary androcentrism of everything that I encountered. So I learned how to combine my love of literature with my feminism and my advocacy for queer activism. And that enabled me to enjoy a long and fruitful career as professor of English and of women's gender and sexuality studies. But I must thank Yale for causing me to become a feminist scholar, because I'm not sure that in a more congenial environment that would have happened.
Thank you, Margaret. Let me turn next to Elizabeth Alexander. Elizabeth.
Muted me, but now you can hear me. Sorry about that. I came to Yale in 1980 from Washington, D.C. I came as a very serious ballet and modern dancer, and within 2 weeks of not getting into the Yale dancers, which at the time felt like the biggest tragedy in the world. A woman named Carol walked across campus, saw me and one of my roommates and said, "Hey, big girls, come and get in the boat." And so within moments, within weeks, I was a crew. I was on the crew team, having never done it before, with mostly people who had never done it before. And so, and still dancing and still mourning that loss, but realizing, and this to the sort of what happened at Yale part of the story, that you could very quickly reinvent yourself, but that reinvention didn't have to mean leaving everything behind. Yale at the time was a place where feminism was very much in the air. The work and the activism and then the teaching that Margaret and many of her colleagues did allowed those of us who came, I think, in 1980 to feel as though we belonged there, even though we had only been there for basically a decade. That didn't mean that there weren't lots and lots of struggles and things to push and things to ask to be different. I was also very involved with African American studies, and what I learned with African American studies and with the feminist atmosphere that was also in the writers who were being published at that moment, who we were reading. We would drive to Bridgeport, get a car from someone, drive to Bloodroot feminist bookstore and restaurant, and eat a delicious vegetarian meal and come back with Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology when it was hot off the presses. You know, of course, no Amazon, no other way to get these essential texts. We brought Audre Lorde to talk at school. Imagine, imagine, imagine. So it felt like a very alive time where Black studies and feminist studies were intersecting, but we also understood that in order to come to Voice, we had to challenge the university, that it wasn't going to center the things that we thought were so important unless we pushed, unless we asked, unless we marched, unless we spoke up in class. And that was the challenge, but I think that was what, when you look ahead to coming back after many, many years away, I didn't think I was gonna go to graduate school when I left. I left and became a newspaper reporter, but in a year I was back in school. And the true joy and privilege of who I was as a teacher was someone who understood profoundly, and this is true in my work at the Mellon Foundation now too, that to love an institution is to challenge it, and that's what it means to be a citizen of a place.
Fantastic, Elizabeth. Beverly, paint us a picture of your 18-year-old self arriving at Yale and contrast her with the current Beverly Gage and a little picture of her as well.
Right, well, I think we're going slightly out of order now because I think—
Oh, I'm sorry, I double jumped over Anna. We'll go back and pick up Anna in a minute.
So my story, which I hadn't realized, is a little bit similar to Elizabeth's. In the sense that I came here kind of as an arts kid. I had been very serious about classical music. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a big classical music town, and I really came to Yale because Yale seemed like the campus among all of the Ivies that had this vibrant artistic life. It had a school of drama, it had a school of music, it had a school of art, and it had this kind of lively culture of the arts among undergrads. And so that was my draw, I think, in coming here. Once I got here, I kind of threw all of that out the window. And I do think for me, as for many people, it became a place of reinvention. Like Elizabeth, so you can't tell because we're on Zoom, but I'm about 6 feet tall. And when you show up at Yale and you're a woman and you're 6 feet tall, the freshman crew coach says, he sits on old campus and plucks all the, so I did that. I don't think I lasted nearly as long as Elizabeth, but I gave it a good try for a few months. But over the course of my time at Yale, I really moved in much more to the study of history and politics and activism. I think one of the enlivening forces really was my classes, and that's probably true for all of us. That's how we all ended up back being professors. But it was also in some ways the pull of New Haven. I remember the 90s, the early 90s being a pretty vibrant moment for activism in ways that I think people don't necessarily remember. And I think for our generation, I was born in 1972. which means that I was born the year that the first class of undergraduate women graduated from Yale. So we were really a full generation out at that point. So it seemed very unremarkable that we were here. On the other hand, we could see all the ways in which that had changed very quickly, but a lot of the rest of the institution hadn't changed particularly quickly at all. So since that moment, I have stayed, I think, firmly ensconced in the history, government, politics end of things, rather than in the musical end of things. But I still appreciate that all of this is around us at Yale.
Good, and now jumping back to the person I should by my own rules have called on, Anna, class of 1990.
Hi, thank you. So I'm from Santurce, Puerto Rico, and my parents just took me to the airport. I remember I had never been on a flight of my own. I had been on very few flights in general. And I hadn't seen Yale at all, other than from the brochures that we did have back then that were in paper instead of everything online. And I remember some friends of my parents from Queens drove me and dropped me off at Phelps Gate. And to be honest, for probably the first semester, if not the first year, I felt that I lived in a movie. I had seen many of these movies about college life in the US, dubbed in Spanish. And I was like, oh my God, this is like a movie. And Harkness Tower would like, it's like, oh, I'm in a movie. So it did feel like being a character of a movie, which was interesting on many levels. And I think that I became more grounded once I found the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. At the time it was called the Casa Julia de Burgos. It's still called that. And I became very active in the Yale New Haven connections through, Wilbur Cross and doing volunteer work in New Haven. I spent a lot of time explaining what liberal arts was and how I was intending to get a job after graduating to my family. So it's like, what are you gonna do with that? So I ended up majoring in economics, thinking that within the liberal arts, that would be the most likely that would lead to a job. And I did work at the Department of the Treasury in Puerto Rico for a few months before deciding that I needed to go back to grad school in anthropology. So it's a big shift. My time at Yale was deeply characterized by the anti-apartheid struggle. And I remember feeling that sense of just joy and power and a sense of possibility through that struggle as well, and developing the commonalities between different aspects of Puerto Rican struggle and struggles of other people of color throughout the global South and the world. And that really marked my intellectual interest more than my major. So my major was economics, my intellectual interest became more Latin American studies and anthropology and all of that. Just even being aware of words in English and slang in English. I mean, I think we had grown up learning English like for an hour a day, so the basic stuff, but just like to get used to people's abbreviations and calling things different. It just took a while, but it really transformed my life. I mean, I never knew what you could be. I never knew that you could do a PhD. I never knew that you could actually make a living with something that you loved, right? I mean, I was prepared to make a living with through sacrifice, but not through joy. And I think that that's the greatest gift. That's a gift that I just hope to pass on to my students, even to my child, just to pass on to people. And so I'm very appreciative for that. I mean, the struggles are continuous. And I am in a department that is very aware of that. So I'm also part of that kind of trying to change the institution that you love piece.
Denise, introduce us to Denise Ho, age 17 or 18 upon arrival.
Sure. So I arrived at Yale in the fall of 1996. I was from California. I was by myself and I had a duffel bag and a suitcase. I was in directed studies in calculus. I think at that time I came in thinking I would be a political science major and maybe become a diplomat, but I realized I didn't really know what that meant or how I was going to get there. I think what was transformative was actually directed studies, and I was a Tamar student in philosophy in the spring of 1997. And I think that it just introduced me to the history of ideas and to the possibility of becoming intellectual and to be able to think, and as Anna said, to make a living doing what you love or studying what you love. So I think over the years at Yale, I was the sort of person who was at the library waiting for it to open on Sunday morning because that's where I would go to read. So since then, I've gone on and studied Chinese history and worked, as Tamar said, on social and cultural history of modern China. And currently I'm really interested in the history of cities and of borders. So my new work is on the relationship between Hong Kong and China.
Those are wonderful stories. I also showed up as a 17-year-old in the fall of 1983. I had been a high school student at the prep school Phillips Academy, where I had always felt like an outsider because, unlike Elizabeth and Bev, I'm not 6 feet tall. In fact, I am just barely a bit over 5 feet tall. And I always felt short and Jewish and like an outsider. And I thought if I came to campus, everybody would just think I had come from Andover and I was this prep school girl, and that I could suddenly somehow pass as WASP, which is the most unlikely thing imaginable for somebody whose name is Tamar, among other things. But I came with the general thought that it was a time to have a new slate, the idea that you could start over again. And even though my ambitions to be somebody who represented prep school turned out to be both incompatible with what I wanted to do and incompatible with what I could do, I ended up finding it to be a place that was a source of intellectual adventure. I came expecting to be a math major. My fall semester of my freshman year was devoted to walking to what we called the land of mathematics, LOM, to do Math 230. I ended up majoring in math and philosophy and also something called the humanities major, which was basically a 3-year version of directed studies where you did medieval for a year, Renaissance for a year, and modern for a year. But the opportunity to take what had been seeded in me at Andover, which was the idea that ideas matter and that ideas are part of what shapes the world in a way that is palpable to all, and that could be explored in such a wide range of disciplines was really magical. So one of the questions I want to ask you is, what extracurricular or co-curricular aspect of the institution sustained you? So in my own case, I was sustained by the Yale Debate Association. I got here as a freshman. I tried out for the team. The coaches were a man named Eric Molenicki and a woman named Pam Carlin, who went on to be one of the most distinguished professors of law at Stanford now. And for me, it was a group of people. We practiced probably 3 or 4 nights a week. We traveled every weekend. I went to Princeton, or we would drive up to Harvard, or we would drive to West Point, or wherever the tournaments were being held. And being able to do something with a cohort of people over those 4 years, debate in particular, was for me one of the most important elements of my time at Yale. Margaret, maybe we'll go again, I'll get chronological correct this time, and you can talk about something that sustained you in the form of community.
Well, the first thing I want to say is my women friends. Coming from a co-ed school, I had had friends of both or possibly even all genders, although that was not a concept in the 70s, I mean in the 60s. But at Yale, it became quickly clear that the few women that you could make strong bonds with would save your life. And so a few strong women friendships with women, and also the places at Yale where women gathered. There was a New Haven Women's Center that was housed in a Yale building. And in the New Haven Women's Center was an outfit called the Women's Abortion Referral Service. This was in the days before Roe v. Wade. And we helped arrange for women with small economic means in New Haven to obtain abortions either in New Haven or in New York. And it was extremely important work, I felt. It took me both deeper into Yale and outside of Yale, because the institution was both in Yale and out of Yale. And it gave me a sense of the broader aims of political feminist activism that I hadn't seen before. And there was one harrowing night when I had borrowed a very bad car to drive a group of women to a clinic in New York, and it started to snow. And I thought, what am I doing? But we all made it back alive. And that kind of mission, although my academic work was extremely important to me, and I'll talk about that when we get to that round of questions, that kind of activism done with and for women was so valuable to me. There was also the Slavic chorus. There were very few women's, or maybe none, singing groups. And I did not have the skills to be in the Slavic chorus, but I knew people in it and I loved their concerts. So that was at the beginning of the formation of groups for women to have solidarity with one another.
Elizabeth, what sustained you co-curricularly?
This I did myself. Also, women friends, and very importantly, multi-ethnic women friends, all of whom were talking out of and learning our ethnicities in a way that we could share. You know, the things that we lived, we were reading books about. Sometimes that wasn't always in class. So I think that having a really heavy and intense autodidactic practice that you share with friends was crucial. If they weren't teaching Lucille Clifton in the English department, which they weren't, then you go read that book and talk about it with your friends. And then when you realize how the resources of an extraordinarily resourced institution can be used in your way, I think about in 1983, I'm sure Margaret remembers this, the Black Women Writers Conference at Yale, where some of us students worked together to bring Alice Walker, Buchia Macheda, I mean, Black women writers from all over the world using the university's resources. So that was part of being friends together. House parties was a part of being friends together, where we made the food that we missed and danced the dances that we missed. And that was a very important and great joy. The corner of College Street, 493 College Street, the Naples corner, that whole orbit was crucial. African American Studies was at 493 College, and there were graduate students at the time. You could get a master's in African American Studies, but you would often then go into the English department for your PhD or American Studies for your PhD to finish doing your work in African American Studies. And the most brilliant, my first concept of graduate students, I never met a graduate student, but here were these extraordinary people talking on the corner for hours. There in Naples is Wole Soyinka. He's come from Nigeria. He's in residence. He's drinking an espresso. You know what he looks like. You've read his books. Maybe you can go over and talk to him. So the magnetic, intellectual, spiritual pull of that corner was community unto itself. And then I would also connect that to, and this is where the kind of, all this is the personal and the scholarly overlapping, to the Beinecke. Because in African American Studies, having the James Weldon Johnson collection, at the time, just about the most extraordinary collection of Black humanities, Black literary culture in an archive. So there were all of our ancestral friends. And it felt like that. If you could go see the first handwritten page of Their Eyes Were Watching God, when you were reading it for the first time and reading that coming of age story as you yourself as a young Black woman were coming of age, that certainly Zora Neale Hurston in the archive was my friend.
Amazing story. Anna, what sustained you co-curricularly?
Just wanted to say, like Elizabeth, the Beinecke still feels that way, which is one of those things that some things are discontinuous, but there's some continuity among through the years, I think. also. I initially sought out Morehouse, the Catholic Center, because I had gone to Catholic school. I mean, more culturally Catholic than religious, but I had gone to Catholic school for 12 years, and there had been a nun who was my math teacher, algebra, whose mother had was part of Morehouse. So she had connected, and she hooked me up with that. And I found some friends through there. But in reality, I feel that it was the cultural centers, I should say, because I also feel that even though Puerto Rican Cultural Center was self-standing at that point, the connection with MECHA, with AFAM, with all the cultural centers was really, really tight. And through the cultural center, I was able to do a lot of other activities that are part of my Yale experience and memory. The connection with Wilbur Cross, as I say, I mean, I still stay in touch with who was my little sister at the time in the Little Sister, Big Sister program. She's a wonderful artist in Barcelona. I mean, just unbelievable trajectory, but that's another story in itself. And also, I ended up being an ethnic counselor, which now is called FROCO. But back then, I think there, so, and it's, again, some of the people who were my counselees at the time remain to this day my good friends. So most of that was also that blend between the personal and the political involvement and the intellectual process. All of that for me was just cohere around that. I mean, I for the first time, I actually heard, I mean, I had grown up in Puerto Rico, so I learned more about the Puerto Rican experience in the US through my friends who had been raised in Chicago or in New York, and noticed the similarities. So I feel like that's such a great part of who I am, even at that level, came from that connection to Yale, and those experiences in extracurricular activities. So, yeah.
Bev, how about in your case?
Yeah, I feel that my co-panelists here may have been better college students than I was, which is to say, I will plead that it was the early 90s and I adopted a somewhat disaffected, slightly scornful sometimes attitude toward a lot of things that I now would look back on and say, I can't believe I didn't get involved with that. And it's somewhat amusing to me because I run a program now, Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy, which attracts, the most ambitious, focused, kind of going to make their way in the world students. And I was not at all like that as an undergraduate. So I did some stuff at Yale. I was the assistant director of the Glee Club, which was an interesting community. It was sort of the last vestiges of my musical past. But I spent a lot of time actually in, I guess I would say, the intellectual circles that were at Yale, but a little bit adjacent to Yale. So one of the things that I think helped make me into an adult was hanging out at a cafe that no longer exists, the Daily Cafe, which was right next to campus. It's now, I guess it's a noodle shop now. But that was, for the early 90s, a really kind of interesting, vibrant place. It had a lot of Yale people there. It had a lot of people from the community. It was a place where people were talking about politics and activism, and the philosophy kids were sitting there doing the extra reading, right? The non-required reading, just because you were sort of immersed in that. And so I would say that culture, which was both on campus and off campus, and really was about a sort of, I wouldn't say autodidactic, but a slightly independent intellectual culture that was enormously appealing to me. It was where I first learned to write and to be a journalist. There used to be this newspaper called the New Haven Advocate, which you would walk into a cafe like that, and Alternative Weekly would be sitting there, and I interned at the Advocate and kind of learned to write there and exploring New Haven. So I think that was my space of vibrancy and sustenance as an undergrad.
Denise, how about you at the end of our list on this question?
Sure. So I think I'll answer the question in two ways. So directly, Tamar, your question is about extracurriculars. And I confess that my extracurricular activity was not very, or we took it seriously, but it sounds a lot less serious than some of the others presented on the panel. I was a competitive ballroom dancer, so I was on the Yale ballroom dance team. And I think it was tremendously fun and exciting, in part because it's something that no one had any background in. So everybody was starting from scratch. Everybody was helping each other. Because we weren't in Boston or New York, we didn't have access to a lot of coaches. So it was something that was this equalizer and also a tremendous amount of fun. So that was what I spent my time doing as an undergraduate. The other piece of your question, I think, has to do with identity. And a lot of people have talked about the people who were their friends. And as I was reflecting on this, I didn't really understand this until I was at graduation and looking at all the parents of my friends, people we were taking pictures with in Branford. I think that one of the things that, one of the biggest commonalities among my friends at Yale was this being the children of immigrants, whether they were Greek or Vietnamese or from Mexico, and the sense of being a first generation American and figuring out how to belong and figuring out how to navigate dual identities was very strong among my friends.
So all of us grew up to become professors and academics, and presumably there was a moment at Yale, or a series of moments at Yale, that gripped us so powerfully intellectually that we decided we wanted to spend our lives doing that. And I remember in particular taking a logic course with a woman named Ruth Marcus, who was the only woman in the philosophy department for many years and was, by any description of the term, formidable, self-confident in her views that she understood the world, but also extraordinarily inspiring and present. And she gave me, through the rigor of her thought and the certainty of the legitimacy of her presence in that department, the sense that philosophy, and in particular analytic philosophy, was a place that women belonged. And so when I got to graduate school at Harvard a few years later, and I met a woman named Chris Korsgaard, who was the first tenured woman in the Harvard philosophy department. And she told me the story that there was a tenured faculty bathroom that was for the tenured faculty only, right? There was, you think there's hierarchy at Yale. Harvard beats that. In Emerson Hall, there was the non-tenured, there was the student bathroom, the non-tenured faculty bathroom, and the tenured faculty bathroom. And of course, for Chris to come in and integrate the tenured faculty bathroom was actually considered a major incursion. And that was a surprise to me, because Ruth Marcus's presence in the philosophy department at Yale in Connecticut Hall, for all of the ways in which she was, I came to learn subsequently, a complicated, polarizing, controversial figure on campus, she was for me an instance of what it was to be certain about the value of the life of the mind. So maybe we'll run in the opposite order and do sort of quick catch on this question. Denise, idea or person that just captured you intellectually as an undergraduate, and then we'll go back, Bev, Anna, Elizabeth, Margaret.
The transformative class for me was actually a class on the diary of Joshua Hempstead, who was a 17th century farmer in London, Connecticut. It was taught by John Demos, and we spent the entire semester working on that diary. We got a bus and went to New London and looked at the original diary. So several people have talked about the moment of being in the archives. So the moment of being with the manuscript and seeing when he recorded his wife passing away with our gloves on, it was tremendous. And it really made me think about history as a way to touch the humanity of people in different times and places.
Good. That's a great story. I read America at 1750 in high school and thought he was really an inspiring historian. Bev.
I don't know that I would point to a single class, but I was an American Studies major, and the American Studies curriculum at that time was history, it was literature mainly, but what was really enlivening to me about it was the sense that what I was learning was making the world so much more interesting to me, and that the pieces that I could take from class, I could now understand the buildings around me differently. I could understand the community around me differently. I could read the news differently. And so that sense of vibrancy and connection, I guess, between the present and the past was quite thrilling. As a senior, I decided, that I was going to do a project that was going to combine all of these things. It was kind of a perfect American Studies senior essay project. I was teaching in a women's prison up the road in Niantic, Connecticut. I was teaching a writing class there that I had no idea what I was doing, but I had put together because I thought that this was, so I was going to write this grand senior essay that was going to be about women's prison literature, but I was also going to bring in the literature from the class that I was teaching. And then I was also going to have my own kind of like memoir piece to it that was going to be the story of my own exploration. So it's going to be literary criticism, all these things. And as you can imagine, that all fell apart in about February. And I did an entirely different senior essay. But what I appreciate is just that sense that there was all of this open space, that you were going to have the resources and the support to try to put these things together and make those connections. And that was just enormously thrilling to me as a young person.
Fantastic story. Anna.
Yes, I'm thinking that there wasn't one moment either. I mean, there were several, but I do remember that the first time that I cried over poetry was at Yale. I had always been very dismissive of poetry, and I guess, in my high school didn't stand out for the poetry teaching. But I remember listening to Pedro Pietri's Puerto Rican obituary in a Puerto Rican literature class that was taught by a graduate student who was in American Studies at the time. And that was just so moving because everybody, after one of the students read it, everybody was just like tearing. And it's just like this, I was like, wow, a piece of writing can do that. And that was like one of those moments of that I immediately like noticed it right there, but didn't retrieve that moment until much later. I didn't know that I was going to do a PhD until I was in it already. I thought I want to do a master's degree, but in order for me to get finance, I can't afford a master's degree, so I'll just apply for a PhD. And I went to Columbia and I applied, for the PhD program, thinking that I would do the 2 years and then I will drop out. I mean, honestly. And so what ended up happening was that I, as part of my training, ended up in anthropology. I ended up going to Chicago and taught at an alternative school in the city in Chicago, and learning the power of teaching there, but teaching in a different way. I mean, I remember that I came with my Yale expectations of teaching and classroom participation and all of that. And the director of that school told me, these kids are in gangs, their parents don't have food, they don't have a roof. I think you need to tailor your expectations of this and do them in a way that is meaningful to people. And that moment also was transformative in making me decide that maybe I can stay in the PhD program and do what I want. So it was that combination of elements, I think. I did not follow a very straight path to the PhD. I really went, I avoided it until it kind of took me over. So, yeah.
Margaret, intellectual moment that you remember.
You want to go to Elizabeth first?
Sorry, I keep losing track of my list. Let me go to Elizabeth and then Margaret. Elizabeth.
Well, what I would just say briefly is that while we don't necessarily, so I, again, didn't know I wanted to be a professor, but knew that I was excited by books and ideas, but there were only 2 Black women on the faculty at that time, Sylvia Boone and Hazel Carby. So not that we can only imagine ourselves in the image of others who are like ourselves, but it is very important to say that. So there was that. As far as intellectual excitement, the late Michael Cook was someone who I had been to talk to a professor in the English department who said to me, and I said, I'm kind of interested in African-American literature. What classes should I take? And was told nothing worth reading was written after 1600. And so I was like, okay. And I walked out of her office and I looked, and there was this long, typed on long paper, Problems in the Study of African American Literature, a graduate course taught by Michael Cook, a course that I later went on to teach myself, which was an amazing thing. And so I went to Mr. Cook and sort of didn't say anything about being an undergraduate. And he said, I want you to read this story and go away and come back, and then I'm going to ask you questions about it. So it was like a proper, can you be in this class? And then once I was in that class, the world just opened up. And part of it was from how he talked about literature and talked about books in the context. I'll never forget the first time I heard John Coltrane, heard anyone talk about John Coltrane, was when Michael Cook was teaching us Michael Harper's poetry. Dear John, dear Coltrane. And he said, you need to know all of this together. And then finally also having Skip Gates as a professor. And in keeping with our important theme of loving and challenging institutions, this was right before he didn't get tenure at Yale. So institutions make mistakes sometimes. But having him working as a research assistant for him on the Black Periodical Fiction Project and going through the microfilm, looking through 19th century publications in the library to find serialized writing by Black women, and realizing that there hadn't been books written about these books that were written and forgotten in the 19th century. So seeing that, wow, you could continually discover. And then I just have to also add, Judith Butler was a graduate student in philosophy, and the only philosophy class I taught was when she taught philosophy and feminism for the first time. And what I learned there was like rock star teaching. She was a grad student, she was brilliant, she was amazing, she was breaking open the field, and there were hundreds of us in that room. And it was very, very hard, and I'm not sure I even understood it, but I understood, as you said earlier, Tamar, like ideas power the world, ideas matter, and learning can be exhilarating.
Fantastic. I'm going to let Margaret answer. We then have some questions from the audience that I'll pose to us, and those we can have maybe 2 or 3 of us answer each one, and so that we get to a number of them. So let me turn to Margaret, and then I have a question from the audience about what work remains to be done to include women in the intellectual and creative life of the university. So you might think about that, and if a couple of you want to volunteer through hand raise to let me know you'll answer that, I'll turn to that after I hear Margaret's intellectual inspiration. Margaret.
So I'll try and be quick because we need to get to the future. But in 1970, Yale was the place to go to study literature. But it was completely taught by men. There were a few women on the faculty, but they were either untenured and certain not to get tenure, or they were the highly accomplished, amazing wives of men who had tenured positions, but the wives had been given positions as lecturer. For me, it was negative and positive. As I said, the experience of being immersed in this completely male world was typified by the dominance of Harold Bloom in those days, for whom literature was an agon between fathers and sons. And it was fascinating, and he was so exciting, but there was no place for women. And I remember in my junior or senior year, being in a seminar with him, and there were a lot of women English majors. And he told us that all of us who had long hair, which included me, many of us had long hair that we secretly cared a lot about despite feminism, that we were styling ourselves after pre-Raphaelite portraiture of women. So the place for women was as beautiful objects. And so my intellectual project began there. I was just irate at the omission of women as writers and as scholars. And my first year teacher for literature, Thomas Weiskell, enabled one of the other women students in the class and I to write a final paper on Gertrude Stein instead of on one of the dead white men that everybody else had to write about. Stein was not in the curriculum, but we were allowed to do this, and that was an extraordinarily enabling thing. He was also the first person who showed me an article about feminist literary criticism in 1971. So there was a window open there through a lovely young male professor. And then I finally wrote a dissertation about women writers in the Romantic period that was a kind of autobiography, because I was trying to figure out how did women writers cope with the overwhelmingly male subject matter and method of prestige writing in those days. And it was a way of thinking about my own position in the Literary Academy. So that was both a negative and a starting point, and a positive starting point for me.
These are great stories, and they have elicited from our audience questions. So I mentioned that the first one is about ways in which the Academy needs to change to accommodate women, or to accommodate issues that women's experience have brought to the front. So when I was teaching the Directed Studies seminar for Denise, I was pregnant with my son, a member of the Yale College class of 2020. And by the end of the semester, my husband was teaching at Cornell that year. I was commuting with the steering wheel very, very far from my hands. And I gave birth over the summer. And then when my son was 5 weeks old, I went to start teaching my class at the university where I was teaching, which was then Syracuse. There wasn't the thought, it didn't occur to me to ask for a kind of accommodation. And the experience of women over the intervening 2 decades actually brought to the Academy's attention that faculty are human beings, and that parenting is done still largely by women, but also by parents of other genders. And accommodating the need for faculty and staff to be able to have lives as caregivers is one of the ways in which the Academy has adapted, perhaps not as fully as it can, but adapted in the face of a lesson that was brought to the fore by the absence of women from the faculty. And I wonder whether a couple of you, if you use the hand raise function, want to respond to the question, what work remains to be done to include women in the intellectual and creative life of the university, and how can those lessons open the Academy more broadly? So Bev and then Margaret on that question. Bev.
Yeah, so I think that in many ways, Yale is a lot of different Yales, and I think a lot of people would say that. And so there are certain areas where, I mean, Tamar, you know these statistics better than anyone at this point, right? You can look at the number of women faculty. It got stuck somewhere for a while. It seems to be going up. It's certainly not 50-50. But I guess one of the things that I would say experientially about being on the faculty of the institution now is that how much I feel my gender identity, how much I feel inside or outside based on that really just depends on the environment that I'm in. And there are certain parts of the campus where it's entirely unremarkable to be a female faculty member. There are other parts of the campus where I still walk into rooms, and I'm kind of surprised every time at this point, but where I'm the only woman in the room. And so I think actually to think about making change at the institution, some of those pieces need to be picked apart a little bit. And one of the things that is of some concern to me, and this panel reflects, I guess, a little bit of this, is that women's faculty power now resides much more heavily in the humanities, a little bit less in the social sciences, and probably least in the sciences, though Tamar, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But as women have come to be more and more present in the humanities, and I think we may even have a department that is more than 50% women faculty now, art history, or at least that's what the Yale Daily News says, so asterisk, but it's at the moment that the humanities are also losing a lot of status, they're losing a lot of power, they're losing a lot of appeal, they're in crisis, and I have spent some time puzzling out exactly what the relationship between those two pieces might be. What is the chicken? What is the egg? Is this coincidence? Are there some set of historical forces at work? And I think the slight shift away from the humanities has been one of the big changes from my time as an undergrad to now, though Yale is still a pretty vibrant humanities campus. And that seems to me somewhat related to gender and kind of where power rests at the university. I thought other panelists might have better answers to that, what remains a question for me.
Yeah, let me call on Margaret, and then I'll say a bit about the demographic data to which Bev adverts. Margaret.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something quick about the student body, which is so much more diverse now than it was in 1970. It's just inconceivable. And I feel that changes in my own teaching and therefore in my scholarship have often come about because of pushing and provocation from undergraduates. I have long taught feminist and queer theory, but I quickly became a teacher of feminist, queer, and transgender theory because the students were irate that I was not doing this. This is a very new field. And students pushed and pushed in the fall of 2015, as we all know, to make ethnicity, race, and migration and other programs at Yale that advocate for diversity stronger financially and institutionally. That came from the students. And so I would say one of the things that Yale has done absolutely best is its admissions policy. And I just hope that it will go on creating these extraordinary classes of diverse students who push us all in the right directions.
So I will just say a little bit about Bev's remark, and then for the closing question, we're coming up near the end. I'm going to ask Denise, Elizabeth, and Anna each to respond to a question we have from the audience about advice for those in the audience who are parents of young women who are not yet even young women, parents of K-12 girls, about the ways in which during this time of upheaval in education, we can provide them with grounding that lets them stay committed to the value of ideas. So what would you say to a young daughter is the question from that colleague. Just quickly, by way of some of the data to which Bev adverted, two striking things. One, if we look at our faculty by cohort and years since PhD, about 10% of the faculty in the oldest cohort identify as women. That is, it's 90% people who identify as men and 10% people who identify as women. As we move down by decade, it's about 10 percentage points a decade. So 20%, 30%, 40%. And in our most recent cohort, we're roughly 50-50. It is not distributed equally across fields. Though one of the things that is exciting is that in the last 5 years, in the biological sciences, our hiring has been fully 50-50 on gender. And even in the physical sciences, the area in which we're least represented in our women faculty, in the physical sciences and engineering, it's been above a third of the faculty who have come in who have identified as women. And we see that change. There's now none of our science and engineering departments that has only one woman. We just hired our second tenured woman mathematician. And we are working, we're not obsessed with getting exact balance across the board, but what we want is what Elizabeth mentioned, which is the presence of people whose embodiment and intellectual subject matter allow others to feel the possibility of that kind of cohabitation, that you can be both at once. So let me take us out on the question from the audience of advice to the next generation. Denise, and then Anna, and then Elizabeth. Denise.
Thanks for that great question. I've been thinking about this in terms of the Yale classroom and then outside of the Yale classroom, because I feel that, at least in my experience over the last 5 years teaching at Yale, I don't sense a strong difference in gender and speaking up and being confident in class. And so the puzzle for me is, once that student or once that young woman graduates, how does she have that same sense of confidence in the workplace, in the wider world, when there isn't an instructor there who knows who's done the reading and who hasn't? So how do you carry that, or how do you cultivate a sense of confidence and then carry that with you after you graduate. So my advice to the young woman is to, or to the daughter, is to be confident in what you know. And so I think our job as educators is to help our students, both male and female, to figure out how to find evidence and how to stand behind it and how to make arguments and how to defend them so that they can have that confidence once they leave the Yale classroom.
Fantastic. Anna, advice?
As a parent, I never give advice on parenting, and that sounded like really close, but I'll make an exception. I did research on parenting very recently on upper class parents in Latin America. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the higher up in the class racial hierarchy, the least we notice distinctions between how women and men are afforded or are raised more equitably. So I think that that's just to say that it's important to be intersectional about all those things instead of just being very general. But one of the things, but another thing that I wanted to point to is that, you know, a lot of times we just expect women in the classroom to be doing the gender work, and even if it is not intentional. And I think we need to hold everybody accountable for doing that work. And so I would say that rather than give any kind of directive of how to, you know, what to advise parents of women, I think it's just all parents to be aware that these issues need to be taken on by everybody. I mean, it's not only a matter of raising daughters in a particular way. I mean, we have to raise sons in a particular way. We have to raise, you know, every child in this new way of being more aware of justice and what justice looks like. So,
Elizabeth.
I'll just follow right on what you were talking about, Anna, because I was going to say I think we have to expand the question to include all of our children. I happen to have 2 sons, but I think that we want all of our children to understand that the world is an abundant place and the world is a tremendously unjust place, and that those things exist at once. I think we want to teach all of our kids to be both questioners, avid questioners, incessant questioners, and listeners. And that's certainly one thing as a teacher I could say to my kids is like, don't be that one who gets on my nerves, who doesn't listen to anybody. And sometimes those are, you know, it's not always the boys actually. So to be questioners and to be listeners. I think that also because we're speaking in a Yale alumni context, and so we're talking about young people who are the children of Yale alums. What does it mean in a rich way to understand your privilege? What does it mean in a rich way to understand that a room that you may be in, every time you're in a room, someone else is not in that room? So how do you literally and metaphorically bring other people into that room? I think it is a tremendous gift that it's very important from a privileged position to say that we all have to work hard for what we have, but that privilege doesn't make you any more special than anybody else, which I think is sometimes hard because there's so much that we want for our children. We want our children for the world to be their oyster, but it's not worth having the world as your oyster if the world remains as inequitable as it is. So I think those kinds of lessons, I think, actually are very useful as they move forward in ever complicated times.
Thank you. I am really struck by the way in which this was a set of stories about one opening leading to more openings up. That Margaret's story about the importance of looking at women actually opens up the importance of looking at the multiplicity of gendered experience. That Denise and Elizabeth and Anna all spoke to the ways in which experience in thinking about gender opens up issues of race, and that itself opens up issues of class, and that, as Bev's work knows, opens up issues of power. And so that as we think about the women at Yale who came either 50 or 150 years ago as individuals whose particular mode of being wasn't obviously part of the voice of academic undertaking, and recognize that any kind of intervention that puts the unexpected into a familiar space is likely to enrich both the individual who arrives new and the work that was continuing. In some sense, all 6 of us study subjects that were studied at Yale 100 years ago. It's not that we have abandoned the ambitions of the liberal arts, of the humanities, of the social sciences, of the sciences and engineering to illuminate human understanding. But the opening up of one door leads to the realization that there are doors, and that in fact, the more kinds of voice that we bring into the room, the richer the experience will be. So a great pleasure to have been with Margaret Hohmann's class of 1974, with Elizabeth Alexander, class of 1984, Ana Ramos-Zayas from the class of 1990, Bev Gage from the class of 1994, and Denise Ho from the class of 2000. And thanks to the Yale Alumni Association for inviting all of us to join.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Eve Rice, Yale College class of 1973, and a current Yale trustee. I've had the privilege of working with Linda Lorimer as co-chair of the 50 Women at Yale 150 initiative, and I also chaired the 50th anniversary celebration last fall. Several years ago, we began a conversation about doing something special to commemorate 2 momentous milestones in Yale's history: the arrival of Yale's first women undergraduates in 1969, and 150 years of women in Yale's graduate and professional schools. We wanted to honor the women who made the milestones happen, but also celebrate the amazing array of Yale women who have studied at Yale over so many decades, including those of you who are listening in the audience this afternoon. As you can see, that early conversation blossomed into a major year-long effort, which kicked off last September with a memorable weekend that brought together the trailblazing women who entered Yale College in 1969 for a first ever reunion. It was quite an event. The year that followed has been filled with stellar programming from all Yale schools and many campus organizations, and now we're here at the year's culminating weekend hearing from so many remarkable, passionate Yale women who are changing the world and making it a better place. There are many, many individuals to thank for this year's commemoration, but I'd like to give a special shout out to the folks at the Yale Alumni Association for their prodigious efforts, as well as our wonderful partners in Yale's graduate and professional schools and Yale College, and of course the dozens of committee volunteers who helped make all this great work happen. For me, these anniversaries are personal. 50 years ago, in 1969, I came to Yale as part of the very first cohort of women undergraduates. Needless to say, I am proud to be part of that first group of spirited, determined women. But I'm even prouder to be part of the extended group of awesome Yale women on this virtual stage, in this audience, and among the thousands of students and alumni, wherever they are, even if they couldn't tune in today. Right now, more than ever, the world needs smart, talented, thoughtful women to apply their energy and expertise across the range of human experience and the formidable challenges that we face. Although none of us can do it alone, each and every one of us can have impact. Clearly, we all, both Yale women and Yale men, have a lot of work to do. So when the conference is over and our laptops are closed, let's go out and do it. Congratulations to Yale on 2 extraordinary anniversaries, and kudos to you all for being fearless, phenomenal Yale women and men. Thank you.
Memories of my childhood live between the rings of sand around my ankles and the desert heat in my lungs. I still believe that nothing washes worry from tired skin better than the Nile and my grandma's hands. Every day, I go to school with the weight of dead neighbors on my shoulders. The first time I saw bomb smoke, it didn't wind and billow like the heat from the kitchen hearth, but it forced itself on the Darfur sky, smothering the sun with tears that it stole from our bodies. The worst thing about genocide isn't the hunger, the murder, the politics, the government-paid soldiers that chase you across borders and into camps. It's the silence. For 3 months, they closed the schools down because people like us are an eyesore. So the first month, we took it. The second, we waited. The third month, we met underneath the date palm trees, drinking up every second our teachers gave us, turning fruit pits into fractions. On the last day, they came with a message, put them in their place. We didn't stand a chance. Flesh was never meant to dance with silver bullets, so we prayed for the sun to come and melt daggers from our backs, lifted our voices up to God until the clouds were spent for weeping, and the sand beneath our toes echoed with the song of every soul that ever walked before us. I hid underneath the bed that day with 4 other people. 12 years later, and I can't help but wonder where my cousins hid when the soldiers torched the houses, threw the bodies in the wells. So if the weapons didn't get you, the poison would, and sometimes they didn't want to use bullets because it would cost them more than we did. But what does it matter? I've seen 16 ways to stop a heart when you build nations on someone's bones. What sense does it make to break them? And one day, my mother choked on rifle smoke. My father washed the blood from his face. My uncles carried half the bodies to the hospital and the rest to the grave, and we watched. For every funeral we planned, there were 60 we couldn't have. The sand and the Sahara tastes a lot like powdered bone. And when the soldiers came, our blood on their ankles, I remember their laces, scarlet footprints on the floor. I remember waking to the sound of hushed voices in the night, etched with the kind of sorrow that turns even the loudest dreams to ash. Our parents came home with broken collarbones and a taste of fear carved into their skin, and it was impossible to believe in anything. Fear is the coldest thing in the desert, and it burns you, bows you down to half your height, and owns you, and no one hears you, 'cause what could grow in the desert anyway? Thank you. My name is Imtithal, or Amy Mahmoud. I am Yale College class of 2016, Davenport College. I'm in anthropology and global health by training, going into medicine, but I'm a world champion poet, author, and goodwill ambassador for the UNHCR, UN Refugee Agency. 2 seemingly competing passions, but they all work together, and I guess that's something that also brings all of us together. The first poem I shared is called People Like Us, and I hope it inspired you as much as you've all inspired me. And this next poem is called Mama, and I'm just really excited to be here and glad to say that because you were all there, paving the way, I think it allows the rest of us to be here, keeping the door open. Never close the door behind you. That's what I hope will take away from all of this. Thank you so much. This poem is called Mama, and it's about all the matriarchs in my family. I hope you can take it with you and feel inspired wherever you go. So I'm walking down the street when a man stops me and says, "Ayo, sister, are you from the motherland? Because my skin is a shade too dark not to have come from foreign soil. Because this garment on my head screams Africa. Because my body is a beacon calling everyone to come flock to the motherland." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm from Sudan. Why?" He said, "Yes, you is. You got a little bit of flavor in you. Don't get me wrong. I'm just admiring what your mama gave you." Let me tell you something about my mama. She can reduce a man to tattered flesh without so much as blinking. Her words fester beneath your skin, and the whole time you won't be able to stop cradling her eyes, because my mama is a woman, flawless and formidable in the same step. Woman walks into a war zone and has warriors cowering at her feet. My mama holds all of us, in her face, in her body, in her blood, and blood is no good once you let it loose, so she always holds us close, keeping us safe from caving in. When I was 7, my mama cradled bullets in the billows of her robes. That same night, she came home and taught me how to get gunpowder out of cotton with a bar of soap. Years later, when the soldiers held her at gunpoint and asked her who she was, she said, "I am a daughter of Adam. I'm a woman. Who the hell are you?" And the last time we went home, we watched our village burn. Soldiers pouring blood from civilian skulls as if they too could turn water into wine. The woman who raised me turned and said, "Don't be scared. I'm your mother, I'm here, I won't let them through." My mama gave me conviction. Women like her inherit bruised wrists, tired eyes, and a titanium-plated spine. The daughters of widows wearing the wings of amputees. They carry countries between their shoulder blades. Now, I'm not saying that dating is a first world problem, but these trifling guys seem to be. The kind who'll quote Rumi, but not know what he sacrificed for war. Who fawn over Lupita but turn their racial filters on, who take their politics with a latte when I take mine with tear gas. Every guy I meet wants me my introduction to the dark side, wants me to open up this obsidian skin and let him read every tearful page, because what survivor hasn't had her struggle made spectacle? Don't talk about the motherland unless you know that being from Africa means waking up an afterthought in this country. Don't talk about my flavor unless you know that my flavor is insurrection, it is rebellion, it is resistance. My flavor is burden, it is grit, and it is compromise. And you don't know compromise till you rebuilt your home for the third time, without bricks, without mortar, without any other option. I turned to the man and said, "My mother and I don't walk the streets alone back home anymore. Back home, there are no streets to walk anymore." Thank you.
My name is Masu Haq Khan. I'm a 1995 Yale College graduate. I was in JE. JE sucks. And I'm an employment lawyer, career counselor, writer, and advocate. As part of the 150th anniversary of Women at Yale, I am so pleased and so honored to be here with my dear friend, the amazing Congresswoman Katie Porter, Yale class of 1996. Katie is serving her first term in Congress as the U.S. representative for California's 45th Congressional District, and she's up for re-election this November. She is also a single mom to 3 awesome kids, Luke, Paul, and Betsy. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. It's so great to do this with you, Masu.
I know, it's so fun. There is so much that people want to hear your views on that it's hard to know where to begin, but I think we'll just start with your top of mind concerns. You're one of the few public figures that we've come to associate with positive impact and action during a time when our nation faces overwhelming problems. The coronavirus, climate change, threats to democracy, problems stemming from staggering racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequity, the breakdown of fair and functioning immigration and naturalization system, just to name a few of the many.
Way to start it out on a lighthearted note. Way to open it up with some nice fluff questions.
Well,
let's just dig into all the problems in the world. And let's hear what you're going to ask me here.
What I'm going to ask you is, out of all of these problems, which are top of mind for you these days as a Congresswoman, and what can and should be done to address them?
Yeah, so I'm not going to swing at what can and should be done to address all of the world's problems. But I will say, I think one of the things about Congress that I didn't appreciate until I got there was that we are not short on problems in this country. What we are short on are solutions. And so I've tried to pick issues where I feel like there's really a need. There is a path forward and just nobody is prioritizing it. And so one of the areas that I've been working on a lot that I think fits into this category is mental health. So we have a really broken healthcare system. The mental health component of it is particularly troubled. People who have insurance discover that, in fact, as a practical matter, they don't really have mental health coverage due to the very limited number of providers who take insurance, incredibly low reimbursement rates, limited provider networks, and things like that. So this is part of both. When we say defend the Affordable Care Act, we also have to acknowledge that we have to be willing to be clear-eyed about where we need to improve the Affordable Care Act. So 10 years ago, we promised the American people parity, that physical health and mental health would be treated the same. And we failed to deliver on that. So this was something I was really interested in before the pandemic, but like so many things, I think this pandemic is highlighting the need for broad-based behavioral health availability. We see it in seniors who are dealing with isolation. We see it with students who are dealing, young kids who are dealing with fear, fear about their parents getting sick, essential workers who are traumatized. And so I also have a bill to work on increasing funding for mental health during the pandemic, and it's given one of these very clever names, Stopping the Mental Health Pandemic Act. And then I also have a bill working on students and mental health, which I think is something that when we were in college in the early 90s, we were just starting to see campuses really grapple with this. But how can we help support students who are facing mental health challenges in college to be able to stay on campus, get help and treatment, and graduate successfully? And so sort of thinking about how we do those things. So that's a big area that I've been working on. And it's one where there's so much bipartisan support that this is one of those problems where if we can't make progress on some of this stuff where we have a lot of bipartisan support, how do we ever build forward to push on harder issues like the exorbitant price of prescription drugs, for example?
Yes. Okay, that's great. So Katie, you just mentioned how the pandemic has worsened mental health issues. The pandemic has really had a dramatically negative effect on so many things, but I want to focus a little bit on your thoughts on the pandemic's impact on working mothers. So as most of us know, you're the only single mom in Congress. And as your friend, I know that even before the pandemic, it was a stretch for you to find enough time to do your work and family obligations in sort of that full-on Hallmark, amazing Katie Porter fashion that we're used to. So you mentioned in a May Atlantic article that since the big pandemic began, in March, you've gone from working 6 to 17 hours a day to 18 to 19 hours a day. And I will be honest, it sounds really brutal and very, very hard to sustain. How are you managing to do all this? And did your days at Yale prepare you for this moment in any way?
So I think like most parents, I'm doing the best I can right now. But I think that the pandemic has highlighted again how hard it is for working parents. And this was true beforehand. And some of it is the level of expectation that we put on workers today and the lack of support that there is. But also seeing that, for example, for me, my professional career, including but not limited to my running for Congress and being able to serve in Congress, would not be possible without a strong public school system, which I feel very fortunate to have. So as schools have closed, my kids have, I've been having to deal with more with my kids, which is a pleasure most of the time, although I do have a 14-year-old. But it's also a lot of work to do that constant juggle. And so I think as we move into jobs and work from home where there aren't such clear boundaries between being at work and not at work, the pressure becomes more and more personal to each one of us to how do we carve out that time. And I think particularly for women, this is extra hard because of expectations in the workplace, because of concerns that you won't be seen as giving it your all, but also because I think kids' expectations from their mothers are different and society's expectations from mothers are different. So one of the things my ex-husband used to say that I really appreciated that he understood this was he would say, you could be doing a great job at the park and someone will point out that your kid dropped the straw wrapper off the juice box on the ground and you did not pick it up. He's like, I could be literally paying no attention at all to these kids reading the newspaper, and I'm like a national hero for taking them to the playground. And so I do think that's part of what women feel. One of the books that I read at Yale that I've thought so much about is I read the book The Second Shift by Arlie Hochschild about how men and women and couples divide up work and family. And what she found was that essentially, even in couples that think they're doing an equal share, women are working about twice as many hours as men. And so because I'm a single parent, it does all fall to me. And I think so much about how many single parents out there are not just in my situation of being a single parent of multiple kids, but also are working at low income jobs, maybe are working 2 jobs, are doing shift work. So the fact that I have a job where I have to fly, where I'm out of town, where I'm gone from my kids, where my hours are unusual, that replicates actually what a lot of working families and working parents feel. And, I commented to somebody earlier today, I said, been thinking about it, and I counted 4 car dealers elected to the United States Congress and 1 single parent. And yet we live in a country where about 40 to 50% of kids are being raised in single family households. So I do think that perspective is important. In terms of what did I get from Yale, I mean, actually some of the reading that I did has been really, really important. And I mentioned one example. Some of those books I think about a lot. They really shaped how I think about the work that I'm doing. Books like Falling from Grace by Catherine Newman, some of the books on economic dislocation that I read. But I also think there's an element at Yale that's like Congress in the sense that there's so much opportunity to lead, to create community, to push forward. And yet there's still the need to sleep. There's still the need to study. There's still the need to do those basic things. And so I think that balancing act is one that I sort of got used to in college and have had to keep going ever since.
So you've just touched on this a bit, but given that this is a celebration of 150 years of women, and this is a serious matter in terms of the impact on women, the New York Times has a quote that says, the pandemic is quote unquote crushing women's careers on a global scale. Do you have thoughts on how this situation changes? Is there anything that could be done on a legislative level to assist women in helping progress in their careers and with their families concurrently?
Yeah, no, I think this is so interesting. I have open on my phone or in the New York Times app, like saved an article that says something like, in the pandemic, you can have a kid or a job, but not both. And in a great testament to sort of how hard that is, I haven't read the article and it came out like 4 months ago. But I do really think about this a lot. And I said to someone the other day, like, I'm tired. Like, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to reconcile these things. And, the person said to me, people are quitting their jobs over this. Like, it is nearly impossible. And I think I have 2 pieces of thoughts on this. One is sort of very personal. I would say 2 women who are dealing with kids and work, or who love or care about women who are dealing with kids and work, whether it's a sister or a family member, is this whole concept of work-family balance is one that I think we need to reframe in our head. And so when I first heard this idea of work-family balance, I took fractal geometry at Yale. Like, I understood the concept of perfect symmetry. So I was like, okay, it's like I have perfect work family and they're just in harmony. Well, if that's your idea of work-family balance, you're basically doomed to be disappointed every single day. And I think the right way to think about work-family balance is more like balancing when you're riding a bike. And so you're going to hit rocks, you're going to have to pedal harder up the hills. There's going to be moments that you can coast and you're glad for them. It's okay to step off the bike and take a water break, but the basic goal is to keep on pedaling, to continue to have meaningful work or meaningful civic engagement, whatever that is, meaningful personal relationships, and be able to be a parent. So I think that's the first thing I would say to people is chuck this idea of perfect balance and substitute this kind of active balance where you're riding a bike and you understand you're going to fall over sometimes if the hurdle is big enough. And then the second thing is, I think there's just a lot more that we need to rethink in terms of how we support working parents generally, whether they're single parents or 2-parent families. The reality is, and this is something that Elizabeth Warren has talked about, is that women entering professions, entering the workforce in larger numbers and staying in the workforce has actually been the major driver of our increase in GDP over the last 50 years. And so it's really, when you look at what was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, women going to work and staying at work, often through their childbearing years as they have kids. And so how do we support that? So investing in kids, investing in childcare, it doesn't just benefit the working parents, it actually benefits our overall economy. And when you look at countries that have done things like close the gender wage gap, when you look at countries that have done things like have truly equal representation of women in boardrooms, in the halls of leadership, in civic institutions, they all have one thing in common, which is major investment in childcare and understanding that as an economic building block, not just as a women's issue. And so I think that's something that we have to kind of keep pushing back on, so that every elected official should care about childcare, because every elected official, I think, would at least claim to be very interested in our country having a strong and stable economy.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Moving on to what you've become famous for, your hearing showdowns. That's our next discussion topic. It's unusual for a first-term Congresswoman to be as well known nationally as you are. And we all know that you've gone viral as a result of your insightful and effective questioning and hearings. So as a member of the House Financial Services Committee and the House Oversight and Reform Committee, you've become famous for asking tough questions of CEOs and administrative officials to hold them accountable to the American people. We've seen you masterfully question Mark Zuckerberg, Louis DeJoy, Jamie Dimon, Ben Carson, and CDC Director Robert Redfield, among others. And we're curious, who was the hardest to question, or which hearing was the toughest for you, and why? So that's the first part. And then the second part of the question is, who or what prepared you to stand up for and to others in such a fearless and effective way?
So I think the hardest witnesses to question are actually the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. And part of that is, while they appear before Congress fairly often, they don't stay very long. And so we've now had 2 hearings in a row where I have not been able to question either one of them because there's just committee members who are more senior who are going ahead of me. So it's been almost a year and I haven't had a chance to question either of them. But I think part of it is they are very used to using technical terms to hide from the meaningful policy questions. And so I think it's, not allowing those to kind of slip away by saying blah, 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 interest rates, monetary policy, blah, 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 and people tune out. The reality is these are the architects of our economy. And so we have to be asking them, what is our economic plan? What are the choices that you're going to make? Why are you making them? And so I think those are the 2 witnesses that I'd like to keep questioning because I just am such a fervent believer that capitalism requires regulators and policymakers to be engaged. Capitalism is premised on things like consumer protection, things like antitrust enforcement, things like transparency and information, low barriers to competition, all of these things. We don't always have those preconditions, which means we don't always have healthy, stable capitalism. In terms of how I prepared for this, I mean, some of it I think comes from having been a professor and asking, a law professor in particular, where I use the Socratic method. And so I'll call on all of my goal is to call on almost all of my students every single day. And so I got used to having to ask pretty short questions. And so I think, some of my students didn't give correct answers. So in that sense, they were really good preparation for some Trump administration officials where they're saying wrong things and you have to hold them to account. But some of it also comes from being a mom. I think we've all had that experience where you ask your kid, did you brush your teeth? And they didn't, right? And so when they say, like you have to have that detector that's like, let me just verify that. And so I think it's being willing to follow up on that. But I often say to people when they're like, oh, these witnesses, I mean, they're so tough. They are nothing compared to trying to get my 3 children to put their cereal bowls in the dishwasher, to brush their teeth, to actually organize their stuff each morning. And so I just think a lot of that willingness to ask tough questions comes from being a mom and understanding that if we're not leveling with each other, we're not really solving the problem.
But I guess the difference in my mind is the power dynamic is so different. obviously, you know, with your children, or at least with my children, you know, they know who's boss. And
well, consider yourself lucky, Masu. I mean, my one son has a sign on his door that says, do not enter unless you're Green New Deal. You know, he called me a neoliberal the other day. I mean, my children are tough. They got it from their mom, maybe. So it's true. I mean, look, there is a power dynamic, but the truth is, think about it this way. When someone like Postmaster DeJoy comes in, he is coming as a representative of the Trump administration who's been appointed to do a job. That's the power that he comes with, the power of the agency. I come with the power of all people in the United States, whether they're Democrat or Republican, voting age or not. I am there to question on their behalf. So that I actually have the upper hand. I am the representative of the people, and your job as a government official is to be accountable to the people. And so I think some of that getting intimidated by these witnesses, it's really about understanding the power that you have when you are an elected official. And as my son always says, with great power comes great responsibility, right, Spider Mom? And so he's always reminding me of that, that I have to take on that responsibility to ask those tough questions. I'll also just say it helps to be funny or to be interesting. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how can I break this topic down so that I can engage people in listening to it. And you know, the last thing I'll just say is a lot of my colleagues, they've said to me like, wow, you're so good at questioning. Like, do you have any tips? And the truth is most of them talk for 4 minutes and then they go, do you agree? Well, at that point, with what? I mean, you've been talking for 4 minutes. And so it's very easy for the witness to filibuster. So I really try to start, like with Postmaster DeJoy. My first question to him was, Mr. DeJoy, how much does a postage stamp cost? Right? And so really getting into that questioning right at the beginning, but it takes a lot of, I think, it's risk-taking really, because when you ask them a question, you're putting them back in control. And so I think there's very much that battle for control as you're questioning a witness, but that is not unlike the battle for control that goes on around, you know, Luke, I need you to unload the dishwasher. Well, I wasn't paid my allowance and I'm opposed to forced labor. And I know you are too, Mom. So I'm not going to be unloading that until you pay up, right? And so I do think, like, I mean, God bless you if you feel like you have all the power over your children. I mean, come help me with mine.
Don't quote me on that. I don't know that that's true anymore, especially with my 15-year-old, but I do have a 5-year-old. And the jury's out on the 12-year-old. Moving forward, I'm looking back at our Yale days. If I remember correctly, while we were undergrads, you weren't in the political union, you weren't a debater, you weren't in the Yale College Council. These are things that are kind of hallmarks of the Yalie who wants to pursue a career in politics. So when in your life and why did you become interested in going into politics?
Yeah, I guess I felt like during college, those organizations were, I don't know, I think about like a lot of guys, like a lot of white dudes wearing navy blue blazers, like accumulating at those events. So it's the khaki pants and navy blue blazer. And also I think that, you know, just like in life, a lot of the people who came to Yale interested in politics were people who had come from privileged backgrounds where they had had parents who were donors. They had known elected officials. Sometimes their parents were elected officials. I mean, you and I went to college with students whose parents were in office at the time. And so I think in college, I just felt much more drawn to working directly on problems. And so you and I got to know each other through the US Grant Program, through teaching underserved kids. I did a lot of community service at Yale. I really enjoyed that. But I guess I didn't feel like those institutions were places where I belonged. And I think that is a real problem because some of these institutions, as you say, are useful training grounds for people who are going to be in politics later on. I also think that, you know, people tend to have very preconceived ideas about what prepares you to be an effective elected official. And I think one of the surprising things is, you know, like when I talk about things like being a mom has helped me be a better elected official, being a teacher has helped me be a better elected official. I think our understanding of what that skill set is a little bit off. So the skill set that a politician needs isn't the ability to debate or to fast talk or to know at birth what political party they want to be part of. The skill that our elected officials need in this country is the ability to communicate. The ability to communicate clearly with the public, what the problems are, what the possible solutions are, where the roadblocks are to getting there, and to bring the public along in that conversation. And so I think sometimes the skills and things that we think make people good elected officials aren't always what really translates into people being effective at doing the work.
That's really interesting. Okay, so I would like to ask you a very interesting question I think that a lot of people want to know about you. You have been quoted as saying, "I'm not being asked to conform to some prior expectation of what a Congress member is, but I'm just getting to be me." I read this quote and I thought, A, this is so true of you, and B, how is this possible? I remember working with you at US Grant. I remember how outspoken you were. You've never been afraid of ruffling feathers or being loud, which is the opposite really of what people traditionally or stereotypically expect a politician to be. I read an August 2020 Elle interview with you when you interrupted the journalist to tell her that you'd stepped in dog poo. I literally laughed out loud, and I thought to myself, that's 100% Katie Porter, and I really don't know of any other politician who would cop to stepping in dog poo in the middle of her Elle interview. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, how and where did you develop the license to do things in Congress your own way? Where does your license to be your own authentic self as a Congresswoman come from? Whether it's, you know, pulling out that whiteboard or wearing the Catwoman suit on Halloween, you seem to
Batgirl.
Batgirl. Sorry. But you seem to have sort of struck your own pathway. You're set, you know, that very few other Congresswomen have. Where does that come from?
I mean, I think there's two things. As I listened to you and I said, you know, that I've never felt the pressure to conform. I mean, I must have given that quote early in my time in Congress, because I definitely have since felt some pressure to conform, but that's partly because Congress is a body made, it's a collective body. We only have power you know, partly through taking collective action, through having enough votes. And so things like the hearings are opportunities to exercise some individual influence, to find your own individual voice. I do think Yale was really, really important for me in this regard. So many different kinds of people from so many different walks of life, so many different kinds of ideas about what they wanted to do, about how they wanted to move through the world. I mean, my Yale roommates, remember back when we were at Yale, they had like group 1 courses, group 2 courses, group 3 and group 4. Well, I had 3 roommates, and we each majored in one of the different groups. So like one was an art major and one was a science major, and I was an American Studies major. So I think feeling like it is your uniqueness that is the contribution. And I think that is something that good education should reinforce to people as they're going through it, that what you have to say or your perspective is worth hearing, is worth knowing. And so I think I try to come at it from that standpoint. But I will say, with regard to the sort of, you know, the Elle interview, I mean, definitely was probably voted in college least likely to ever appear in a fashion magazine. I think I wore the same sweatshirt like every day that I was at Yale, and the same pair of like very inexplicably baggy jeans. That said, I mean, I think one of the things that elected officials fall into is this sense of holding themselves separate from the people that they represent. And the truth is, life happens to us too. We have kids who get sick. We have, you know, we're caught in long lines. We have all the same challenges that a lot of Americans face. And I think the more that we acknowledge that, rather than separating ourselves from the American people, the more we're going to be able to have real conversations with them about policy problems. But I will only just say about kind of where I got it is I'll share this childhood story. I'm not sure I've ever told anyone this before, but when I was little, like 2 or 2.5, 3, my parents would say to me, "Not one more word, Catherine." And I would say, okay. And I knew what I was doing. Like I knew I was giving them sass by saying okay, right? Even then. And so I think, it took pretty strong parents, and it took pretty strong educational institutions to sort of shape me. But I'm really grateful for all of those who've tried to corral me, who've taught me along the way, whether by being my friend or in a formal classroom setting.
Well, you have been such a trailblazer in Congress, and I know so many of us appreciate that about you and really hope to see more people follow your lead in that regard. So we're almost out of time, but I have one last question. You arguably have one of the hardest jobs in the country right now, but it must feel immensely gratifying to know that you spend most days as a Congresswoman fighting the good fight to fix some of our country's hardest problems for some of its most vulnerable populations. What advice would you give to Yale women of our generation who are watching this conference, who want to contribute to fixing some of the problems we've discussed, but don't work in professions where they do so directly? Other than voting and contributing to or helping the campaigns of political candidates whose platforms align with our values, are there any tangible action items you would urge Yale women like me who are hungry for positive change in this country to take in order to help address some of our most pressing problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things about democracy that I think is most difficult for us to grapple with in the wake of the election of Donald Trump is democracy is actually our collective responsibility. A functioning government is not just about me, people in Congress. It's actually about all of you. It's about each one of us doing our part. And so I think people that means that learning about issues, finding ways to get engaged. So whether it's working with a nonprofit, whether it's being vocal about a particular policy issue, whether it's getting engaged at the local level, those are all really meaningful things. I'll also tell you that the number one thing that we need in this country is good ideas to solve hard problems. And so when I was an academic, as a professor, I worked on what I hoped and believed were good ideas to help solve problems like the foreclosure crisis. And so I think part of it with democracy is understanding that we all have to be doing something, but giving ourselves permission that something looks a little bit different for every person, and it looks a little different at different stages of our lives. And so there were times in my career where I could not imagine having undertaken running for office. There were times while I was doing it that I asked myself, why the heck did I undertake this? And there are days when I'm doing the job now that I think to myself, this feels impossible. But that is actually the responsibility, the sort of weight that democracy puts on each one of us. And the question is, how do you pick that weight up and move it forward? And I think that's going to look really different for different people. But I think that is sort of really key to how we fix things. The problem of rebuilding our government isn't going to go away after the November election. And it doesn't matter who wins. We can elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We can elect Donald Trump. The reality is our country's still going to have some really big problems. Our world is still going to have really big problems. And so I just encourage people to think about how to use their talents, how to use their energy, and to get engaged in these issues and understand that no matter what your career is, no matter what you're doing with your life right now, whether you're retired or just starting your career looking for a job, you have a democratic responsibility. You have a responsibility to this country as someone who loves this country and wants to see it become better, to step up. And then give yourself a lot of freedom to say what that step up looks like. It might be very different for you than for someone else.
Katie, that response was so inspiring, seriously.
Does that mean you're going to run for Congress, Vasu?
I am going to step up and provide good solutions to hard problems. That is my goal and the way that I can do it right now. But you really do inspire me, and you inspire so many women and men across this country. But particularly, we're honored to have you among our ranks as a fellow Yale woman. Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. It's always energizing to talk to you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. It was my pleasure, Katie.
Absolutely.
Hello, my name is Wei-Li Cheng. I am the Executive Director of the Yale Alumni Association. In August of 1973, I left my home in Honolulu, Hawaii for Yale, a place I had never before seen. At the time, I had no idea of the experiences and the opportunities that Yale would afford me. As I have listened to our speakers over the last several days, I have noticed that our Yale experiences and opportunities have been markedly different. We are, after all, a diverse group of women. We span many generations, identities, and Yale affiliations. And we are so strong and talented. I am proud to be a woman of Yale. What are your takeaways from this conference? My takeaway is that our experiences and opportunities at Yale and because of Yale have influenced the choices and decisions we have made. Those choices and decisions are now more important than ever. We can influence our communities, we can take action that makes this world a better place. I am grateful to everyone who has helped us mark these historic university milestones and helped us focus on the role of Yale women, not just at Yale, but in our world. I want to thank the staff at the university, including the staff at the Yale Alumni Association and our campus partners. I also want to thank the hundreds of volunteers who have made 2 years worth of events and programs a reality. Above all, I would like to thank Eve Hart-Rice and Linda Lorimer, 2 amazing volunteers who conceived of and led the planning for this event and the events over the last 2 years. And of course, I thank you for being a part of 50 years of women students in Yale College and 150 years of women at Yale.